Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology. My name is Leah Hopkins. I am the manager of museum education and programs. And I am very happy to welcome you all here to the Manning Hall Gallery for this evening's program, reception, and book talk with Doug Anderson. Just a few things before we begin. I just need to let you know that in case of an emergency, there is an exit right behind you. You go through the double doors and out to the main green, or you go around this wall, but you can only go this way. And there's a glass door with large double doors out to the quiet green side. And there's also a handicap accessible ramp and stairs right down. If you need to use the restroom at any point, you can also go out this glass door here and to the right. And then there's also a restroom at the top of the stairs if that one is occupied. We have a number of programs this spring. So Doug is right in the middle here. Our next set of programs, and you can scan the QR code for more, is our Gather, Make, Sustain series. We have an artist talk with Karen Ann Hoffman, who is an Oneida beadwork artist. And then the next day, she'll be doing a beadwork demonstration right here in the gallery. So you can see her raised beadwork. It's quite lovely. We also, on May 1st, will have our final installment of the Gather, Make, Sustain series with a virtual lei workshop with Makana Kushi, who is Kanaka Ma'auli. And you can learn how to make your own Hawaiian lei out of eyelash yarn. And this is very popular for students, especially those who are graduating, as this is a big graduation tradition. And then finally, on May 3rd, right here in Manning Hall, we have student presentations, a 19th century journalist's global collecting, which is the culmination of Christina Hodges' class. Can you give a wave, please? And those students have been working in here every week. They've been working with the collection. They've been learning different things. And so you can come and see the culmination of their projects. So as we welcome our speaker tonight, I just want to, again, thank you all for coming out. Feel free towards the end of the program to grab more refreshments and then meet us in the corner right over there as Doug will be signing his book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the microphone over to our director, Bob Purcell.
Thank you very much, Leah. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded this land with great care, continue as a sovereign nation today. We are committed to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. So good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this wonderful event this evening, celebrating actually Doug and Wani Anderson, and I'll say a few words about you, Wani, in just a minute. Doug is an emeritus professor in the Department of Anthropology and the director of the Circumpolar Lab at the Haffenreffer Museum. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Washington with an anthropology major and a geology minor in 1960. He joined the Brown faculty as the first J. Lewis Giddings graduate students in Arctic archaeology. He received his master's degree in 1962 and then spent his Fulbright year in Denmark studying Arctic collections. He then attended the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his doctorate in 1967 under the direction of Froelich Rainey. Doug returned to Brown in 1965, before he finished his PhD, first as an instructor, and then he was appointed as an assistant professor in 1967 when he finished his PhD. He rose through the ranks, becoming an associate professor in 1970 and a full professor in 1979. In 1973, he established the department's Laboratory of Circumpolar Studies, which is located in Bristol at the Haffenreffer Museum. And he has trained a whole generation of Arctic archaeology students, many of whom have jobs with the Forest Service or the Park Service or the BLM. He has been a visiting lecturer at several universities in Thailand and was a postdoc fellow at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. All told, he's spent more than 50 years conducting ethnographic and archaeological research in Alaska, especially in the Kobuk and Selawik River areas in the northwestern region of Alaska. His research focuses on subsistence and trade economies of the early Alaskan people, as revealed by their households and their material culture. His work has helped define the nearly continuous occupation of Arctic native Alaska for more than 10,000 years. Now, Doug's work was accomplished in close collaboration with his wife, Wani Anderson. Wani was an adjunct professor in the Department of Anthropology and Ethnic Studies and is a research associate right now with the Haffenreffer Museum. She's taught since 1988 in the Departments of Anthropology and American Studies. She served as 6 years as associate director for the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. Her teaching and research interests include ethnicity and identity, folklore, and nationalism. Wani herself has conducted extensive ethnographic research in the Kobuk and Selawik River areas of Northwest Alaska. And in fact, she and Doug have just, actually it's in print right now. It's going to be published next month, she told me, a book called The Iñupiat of the Sea, Historical Ethnography and Arctic Challenges with the University of Alaska Press. And this follows up from their earlier book, Life at Swiftwater Place, Northwest Alaska, at the Threshold of European Contact in 2019, also with the University of Alaska. So following Doug's talk, he will sign copies of his book for those of you that have registered online. So with that, please join me in welcoming Doug.
Do you need to hook this up or?
We'll get you.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you for all coming, and this, especially on a cold day like this. This is certainly reminiscent of living in the Arctic. This, to start off with, the title of my book was the Iñupiat over the past millennium. To be one thing, the Iñupiat, I didn't want to use the term Eskimo in that for obvious reasons. Nowadays, the word Eskimo is considered a bad word by most people, saying it's pejorative on this. The Eskimos or the Iñupiat in Northwest Alaska don't see it that way, although they are learning now that it is derogatory. Before, they didn't realize that it was derogatory. They call themselves Eskimo to outsiders on that. But the Iñupiat Eskimos is just the northwestern Alaskan series of groups of Eskimos who cover all the area from actually from the tip of Asia, of Northeast Asia, all the way over to Greenland. They're closely related to the Inuit in Canada and the Inuit in Labrador too. Not so closely related to other Eskimo groups, the Yupik Eskimos, who are down in the southwestern part of Alaska, but they are definitely related. Of the Iñupiat, I started the book off at about 1000 AD, a little bit earlier than 1000 AD, because from then on, the relationship between the people at that time and the modern Eskimo or the modern Iñupiat, and I'll call them Eskimo. I'm so used to that. The relationship is such a direct continuity. There's simply no question about that for the last 1,000 years. Now, the continuity very likely goes back many, many thousand years earlier, back to at least 10,000 years ago, if not even a bit earlier than that. We don't have actual evidence of that because we need skeletal remains, human remains, to demonstrate that, which we don't have on this. But I see no reason not to accept at least that if not a full direct continuity, at least partial continuity for that whole 10,000 years on that. So this is for the area that we're dealing with. The modern Eskimo in Northwest Alaska are living, of course, in a modern stage, but there's so much of their way of life is still continuity with what was earlier. Okay, the one thing that in Alaska, Northwest Alaska, there's many different kinds of habitats, most of which for persons who are used to thinking of Eskimos living in the ice, snowy areas of eastern Canada, this seems a bit different on this. I mean, I think that a lot of our early images come from things like old films of Nanook of the North. I don't know how many of you ever seen that one, but it's a masterpiece. But also modern Nova films about Inuit or Eskimos in general focus on the eastern area because it's ice and snow. They rarely see the rest of the year when it's not snow. But we have that in the Northwest Alaska, you have areas that are forested there, both or spruce forest and other kinds of trees on this. Areas that are open tundra. I wouldn't call it grassland, but open tundra on this. Areas that are down in the lower part that are lake and small rivers there. In addition to on the lower right hand, in addition to the actual tundra, the very low bush tundra. So we have all of those types of habitats. What it means is that the people who are living there have a whole variety of selection of what areas they can go and live on this to make a living on that. Now, Brown University has been involved with excavation and ethnographic and archaeological research in Northwest Alaska now for over 70 years. And it started when the first director of the Haffenreffer Museum was hired from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. J.L. Giddings. This first came here. I was one of his first students here on this. We covered a large area of Northwest Alaska on this, an area about the size that's at least 10 times the size of Rhode Island on this. And I think it's many times more than that on the size of Rhode Island. But basically, almost all of the research in this region is archaeological research, and much of the ethnographic research has been conducted by Brown and by graduate students and undergraduate students here. The collections from the archaeological sites there, most of those are here curated by the Haffenreffer Museum for the Department of the Interior, mostly National Park Service, but we also have Bureau of Land Management, and even collections that are under the official jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But the collections are here and are organized. Most of them are housed out at Bristol in the section, or the annex, I guess we would call it now, of the Haffenreffer Museum. They are open for research for any scholar internationally. In fact, we have many scholars from many different countries who've come here and spent time doing research on the collections, and we certainly welcome that. Now, for our own research that has gone into the book, we've worked very closely with the Iñupiat in the region on this, and this is under many different contexts on this. The upper left hand is part of the local Iñupiat, who near one of our sites, they're members of the local tribal council, and they've worked very closely and are very interested in our work. They have been over the years of that. Other work we've done, like the upper right hand, especially with my wife, has worked much as while we're excavating, has worked with the ethnographic, with the different families that we've hired Eskimos the whole time. We hire Eskimos for most of the work because they're really the experts on that. But then they're there with their whole families, and so it's an ideal occasion for the wives and the children to be playing around the site, for us to be able to get to know the families as families very directly of that. Also, we've spent time out hunting, or I have at least, out hunting with the Eskimos on this. I'm not a hunter at all, and it's always been a kind of a mixed feeling for me going out to kill caribou and all. But it's something for if you're living in the north, you're going to have to be a hunter. There's no way about it. Otherwise, you don't survive. And so it's something that I've at least had to manage with. The lower part, much of my wife's ethnographic work has been recording not just oral history, but the ethnographic part, the life in the past on this. That many of the oldest of the elders, in fact, when we first started doing the research ourselves up there in the mid 60s, 1960s on that, many of those old individuals there that we got information from them, they're long gone. In fact, even their children, most of them are gone, as their grandchildren, who are now the adults in the area. But there's still a tremendous amount of information available. In the middle right-hand side, some of these villages you wouldn't expect as an Eskimo village, but there's one of them. Every year when the spring flood hits, when the ice breaks up, the whole area is flooded out, and so it's a matter of shifting over from winter life on the ice to summer life, which is with boats and all. And that's just part of every year. It's that rhythm of the life there on this. Now for our excavations, and this is the way I've set up the book, is that the Eskimo settlements, over time, many of the Eskimo groups lived in isolated households over the landscape, and they may be just like one house or the next house or the next family, maybe something like 40 miles away. They're really dispersed over areas, and other times they lived in villages. And part of working out with the archaeologists, trying to understand why is it that at times that they congregate like this, other times that they disperse over the landscape. The houses at the upper part there, these are houses that right now they're abandoned. When we were first working in the villages together, these places were still lived in, and these are basically what we would call semi-subterranean houses, where the floors of these houses are a good 2 or 3 feet below ground level. All of the sawed earth that all has been piled over the framework on that for insulation on that. But then when these houses have been abandoned on this, what we see is just simply a depression in the ground. So at least we know where a winter house is located on that. And so for the winter houses, they're quite easy to spot up there, even through the vegetation. the problem is for other parts of the year or in winter when people are living in tents for one reason or the other. Of course, that's like in the upper right hand. It's right on the ground on this, and the snow is around. The snow is kind of the insulation for them on this. But then when in summer comes, it's all melted away. There's nothing left on this. The lower part on the lower left hand is a photograph of one of the winter house pits that we've been excavating there. This is pretty much what one finds left in the field on this. The one on the lower right is just about an inch or so below the ground level, just where the sod has come over and just filled in where there used to be a tent site. But this is in a way what we're confronted with. And in the section on the book, and I talked about settlements. I'm trying to include all of the different kinds of settlements that we have some evidence for. And part of this is in the middle sections, mapping areas where we have the houses on this. The middle right side is a village on this, on there, where probably most of them were living together in the same village on that. We're not totally sure that they were all occupied at the same time, but at least it's probably the same group, the same family that is there. Over on the middle left-hand side is a huge area where there's lots of different settlements. In fact, that site is known as Cape Krusenstern. It's one of the foremost archaeological sites in the Arctic, from which archaeological sequences have been developed, at least for northwestern or northern part of the Arctic on this. The lower right-hand side is pretty much our outlines of the house pits we've had that we work out to try to reconstruct what these houses look like. Most of them have long tunnels in them. And the tunnels are a bit lower than where the floor of the house is. But in order to get into these houses, people would have to crawl in. It was never enough size to walk in. They'd crawl in till they get to the main house. Very often then they would climb up under in a hole from the floor up onto the house floor itself. We have different size houses. The one on the house, the left-hand side, is a single family house, pretty clear on this. The large one is probably a community house. And so we have different types of houses and all, that are all mapped out in the settlements. And there's a large section, one of the whole chapters in the book is dealing with these issues of settlements and trying to understand why big settlements, why small settlements, and all. Now, the one thing too, and one of the themes, a major theme of the book, is to understand life of the Iñupiat in the area on this, in a region that has fluctuating resources. Sometimes there's a real abundance of food. And this is at the upper left-hand side, those are caribou. And it's just simply, you can imagine how many animals there are there at times. This is a migration time, but even other times of the year, there are so many, there are thousands of the animals. So in those years, hunting is easy on this. When on the coast, the last few centuries, it's been primarily seals that are there. Seals don't congregate anywhere near like the density of caribou do. So seals are, you can, if you have the right technology, seals can be gotten, but not many at a time. And so the coastal sites, in areas where there is not the really big animals like whales, it's a bit more chancy when you're for the Eskimo groups to live there. In areas, and this is something that one doesn't normally associate with Eskimo life, is fish. And fish are really a critical resource. In the interior, the fish, some of the rivers are really teeming of fish. And in fact, the latest village where we've done our most ethnographic research recently is a village out in the watery area, no trees around and all, but there are fish everywhere. And basically, the people have really rely on fish. They hunt if they can find caribou. They certainly will get the caribou, or they'll go out to the coast and get seals and all. But for steady living, they really need to depend on fish. And fishing, the resource is pretty constant, but the problem is that in order to preserve fish, at least in this area, the fish is dried. These are all being hung to dry. It depends on the weather. And if it's a wet summer, their whole drying is really difficult. In fact, a lot of the fish will spoil on this. So they really depend on a nice dry summer in order to have ample fish supply on this. Now, the way I frame the book, there are two major challenges. One of them is the challenge of managing fluctuating resources. I mean, when it's good times, it's fine. But when it's bad times, when a number of resources, like for example, the caribou all disappear at the same time that you have a rainy summer where the fish resources are poor or destroyed on this, it's very difficult. And so what we have as the evidence is that at least in Northwest Alaska, the families or the Eskimos have lived there right on through the good times and the bad times, which means that they've really had to maintain a way of life that when bad times hit, to know what to do and how to do it. The theme, what we've done is that my conclusion is that at least for the last 1,000 years, and a bit more than that the groups have pretty well solved all of their technological problems, and especially having to do with subsistence, so that the styles of objects may change over time, but the basic form and the basic function and structure of these different objects have been solved thousands of years ago, so that they've maintained it right through time. Now it makes it very nice for archaeology, and in a way we're really in an envious position up in the Arctic that we know exactly what these implements are used for. It's not like in so many parts of the world you find arrowheads or whatever, and you can pretty well assume, well, maybe it was used for this or for that. Up there we know exactly what they were used for on this. And so in the book, one of the chapters really focus on exactly identifying so many of the objects. Subsistence-related objects are the easiest to identify. You can see the arrowheads, you can see harpoon heads, stone arrowheads, on this a fish hook, on this fish sinkers at the bottom here. Even that lower left hand is a blunt arrowhead. We're not sure whether it was used just simply for small fur-bearing animals, or it could be used for hunting birds too. And with birds especially, or small fur-bearing animals, you don't want to puncture the skin because you want to use the skins for clothes and all. And so a blunt arrowhead, you stun the animal or the bird, and you have it pretty well intact. But we're able to identify each one of these objects quite readily there. So that was the one focus was on analyzing our archaeological material based on how they have managed to develop technologies that allows them to hunt and to fish over any kind of period of this. The second big issue, though, for the Iñupiat is resources. Now, one of the things that we could spot early on in the excavations in this is that the Eskimos acquire lots of different materials. So we've counted over 70 different raw materials that are used right in that area. Now the thing is that these raw materials are not spread out evenly over the whole landscape. They're different raw materials, like for example obsidian as a stone, or chert, or jade, are very localized where their original sources. But what we find is that so many of these resources are spread out over the whole landscape. Now, which means that different groups had to accumulate them some way. There are now a possibility, I guess, would be that they could make forays over a huge area in order to acquire jade or not. We don't have evidence of that. What we have as evidence is that local groups manufactured whatever the local materials were, and then it looks like they were trading it out to different groups of that over the whole area on that. So we find, like in an area where there's jade, we find with an archaeological site, we find not just jade tools, but we find many pounds, tens of pounds of jade flakes, and all evidence that they were manufacturing jade. And we find jade, the finished jade materials, spread out over a very large landscape, which then indicates trade. Now, that's fine. The trouble is that the various groups up there live in tension against the others. I won't say that they're always a matter of warfare, but they really consider a neighboring group one with suspicion of this. And in fact, a stranger is a person to be avoided. And so the problem is, how in the world do you get a trade or going over an area where everybody distrusts everybody else? And it's a big problem. Now, we have a hard time with the archaeology and analyzing exactly what these tensions were, and so we've used the distribution of the raw materials and how it's changed over time, with trying as a kind of a way, as a substitute of looking at the interaction, the intensity of interaction. And sometimes we find, for example, obsidian, that we find that lots of obsidian implements on the upper half of the river. You come down a certain point on the river, and then below that you have nothing, no obsidian. And so it's very clear that there's some kind of social barrier right there. So we are able to get at least some indications of social relationships there. Now, the biggest problem is between the Indians, or the Eskimos, and the Indians. The Indian groups traditionally are seen as the enemy in a way on this. even though there's intermarriage between, but basically the enemy. The Indian groups, so those are the red and the orange. Those are the whole big areas of the Indians in Alaska on this. The blue are the different Eskimo groups. The striped area in the blue is exactly the area where we've spent most of our work on this. But trying to work out the patterns of exchange. Now, there's where a lot of the archaeology helps a bit, but it's really the ethnographic information that is important. And it's very clear that Eskimos have developed many elaborate ways of overcoming the problem of suspicion with the neighboring group. One of the ways is to develop a partnership with somebody. If you can find, say, for an Eskimo living in one area, they can find an Indian, an Athabascan Indian over on the other side, and they develop a partnership. Well, once that partnership is set up, then it means if the Eskimo wants to travel into the Indian area, which otherwise would be really dangerous, but what you do, or they would do, is go quickly. They'd know what village the Indian partner was in. They would quickly go to that village, enter that house before anybody could do much on this. And as soon as they had somebody in the village that could vouch for them, then they were safe on this. If they didn't have somebody to vouch for them, in fact, they would be in real trouble. That's one of the techniques. Another technique has been what I call timeout behavior, that the different groups, it's interesting, and I still never quite figured out exactly how come it works so well, but there are periods where they have trading rendezvous, which different groups will assemble at one place, and these are enemy groups with each other, but everyone will assemble. Each group will live in its little, or camp in its little area, very enclave, but they would trade back and forth. But the idea is that no fighting at all. That was the rule, no fighting and all. So they do the trades and all of this, and then they would disperse afterwards. And so this is another way of getting the different resources distributed on that in face of what's really potentially dangerous situations. So this is something that we've worked out in the archaeology as much as we can, although not anywhere near what I would like to be able to get as much information as possible. The technology part, I think we're pretty clear on. The social relations part is much more difficult. Part of this is like the tension, this group, there was warfare there, and certainly in the folklore, there's stories after stories of one group coming in, raiding another one, stealing the men, stealing the women, or going in, basically killing off as many as they could. They may steal some of the children too, to take them back to your side on this. We don't have that much good information or from the archaeological remains to say that that's exactly what's happening. But we do find in some sites slat armor. And this is armor, this is an ethnographic one over on the right-hand side. The armor itself, I'm sure is somehow the Eskimos learned how to make, or in order to make slat armor, probably from Asia. I mean, just think of all of these samurai pictures you've seen with their slat armor and metal and all of this. Well, these are antler replicas of that slat armor. Well, we find pieces of the slat armor, and that's over on the left-hand side, in a number of our archaeological sites. Now, I'm not simply assuming that as soon as you find slat armor that they were fighting, that they were engaged in warfare. There's one of the things that with armor, it's a great prestige item, and so if somebody has as a leader, in order to demonstrate his status, wearing slat armor was one of the ways to do it. You could sort of strut around with your slat armor, and that would tell people, I'm a big man on this. And so when we find it, we know status is involved in there. We don't know to what extent warfare, every time we find it, they were actually fighting. But that's one of the at least social relations that we've been able to work out on that. Now another part of Eskimo life, they are highly decorative implements. That the part of it, some of these, I think, like for example, the combs, that's in the upper middle area. These are hair combs. They're all nicely incised pictures on this. As far as we know that this is just decorative, although we're not totally sure. Other parts, it's hard to know. Like for example, the middle right-hand side, those long antler strips there are brow bands that the hunters would wear around their forehead on this. We have ethnographic descriptions that the brow bands were a sign of status of the whaling captains. The descriptions that the whaling captains are the ones that were the only ones that were really allowed to use these bands, because they were a matter of a real insignia. Now, part of the design on that Y motif there, it's what I call a diving whale fluke. There, it's a diving whale, but this is what you see. It's just a Y shape on this, but we find that especially associated with those kinds of status items there. Now, it's like anything else in archaeology, it's never that clear cut, because we find that same design even up the rivers in places people were not whaling for sure, but they have the design. So it looks like that at least maybe early on these were whaling designs, but then later on it just became a regular design. Now for the human figurines, again, some of them, it seems like that these are just simply dolls that were used for kids. But some of these are so elaborate that they probably have had some kind of ritual or significance to them, but we're not sure. We just don't know one way or the other. Other types of designs, over in the middle right-hand side, the Eskimos were keen on making kind of cartoon figures, carving the incised on many of the ivory or antler pieces on this. The pictures of Eskimos in boats and some at hunting, and you can see the one figure in the middle there. He's got a spear thrower, and he threw a number of spears into a caribou on that. This is something that that Eskimo art is really quite elaborate, not just in the northwestern area. In some areas, it gets even more elaborate down in the southern area. Much of the what so-called Eskimo art we have nowadays, though, that is the eastern area soapstone art and all. Actually, that soapstone art is one that was introduced by a Westerner, and it was not originally Eskimo art, but it's the Eskimo is the end of his name was James Houston, is the one who actually introduced that art into the eastern area. But in the west, these carvings, the fish you can see down the lower part, these are large fish. They're so lifelike, you know exactly what kind of fish they are. Grayling, and the lower part is a pike, even with the scales and all carved in. Now different kinds of design motifs we see over on the lower right-hand side. Their circle and dot is one we find in a number of different places. Lots of other triangles and lines, ladder designs and all. They obviously have some kind of significance, but we just don't know what they are. It's really frustrating not to be able to know for sure these are. But they are found over a very large area, Eskimo area. Now another part is rather surprising. One doesn't normally think of pottery use among hunter-gatherers. The idea is, well, for people moving around nomadic all the time, carrying a clay pot is going to break and all, so that it's not a very useful thing. Eskimos in Northwest Alaska were master pottery makers. At every one of our sites, we find bushels of potsherds. Now, the only difference between Eskimo pottery and pottery from down in the areas we think of mid-continent is the quality. For Eskimo pottery, they just couldn't get they didn't build furnaces at all. There's no forced oxygen into any kind of kiln or anything like this. So it's all just pretty well open fires, which means that the pottery itself is fairly flimsy on this and easily breakable. But they certainly had it. And different designs, decorative designs, we have evidence that the pottery of different sorts, there were some pottery villages that actually traded pottery out to other villages. And so this is something we've also tried to track in the book. We've discussed that. Now, the other thing that is surprising is glass beads. Now, it's interesting that for glass beads, this is one of the first trade items into the Eskimo area. And in fact, we've got good evidence with the dating now that beads came in a good 50 to 70 years earlier than the earliest European explorers got there. So the beads were coming in from trading from one Indian group to another Indian group until they got to the Eskimo areas on that. And so that the Eskimos were very familiar with items like glass beads and all. They utilized it in their clothing and various other kinds of decorations on this. And so when the Europeans first arrived there, one of the things that was so interesting that the Europeans were amazed at what great traders the Eskimos were. In fact, they were for the Europeans, they were kind of chagrined that they were very often were out-traded by the Eskimos themselves. The Eskimos were more skilled at trading than they were, than the Europeans were. It's something that trade was a very important component of the Eskimo world. And when the Europeans first came in, it totally changed the settlement patterning of the Eskimo groups themselves, because especially for the interior Eskimos, they wanted to be out there when the trading boats got there. And the trading ships, when they came in, could only come in after the ice went out, so that they knew it would be about in the first or second week of June, finally a European vessel could come into area of Northwest Alaska. So different Eskimo groups in the interior who used to be going over the landscape in the interior now were drawn out to the coast because they wanted those trade items. And so it was a totally different settlement patterning. And we can see that in the archaeology in the book that I tried to get through, trying to map how that change in settlement patterning occurred based on the attraction of trading vessels once they got into the area. So this is those are the parts that I was quite secure about. this is the final part. This is a section that at the end of the book that I really struggled, should I include it or not on this? And I'm still, it's there, I did include it, but I'm still, the verdict is still out on this. One of the things that over the years that I've kind of chastised a number of my colleagues. And I say that in an archaeological excavation, what you need to do is I pinpoint virtually every object that you locate. Now, many parts of the world, that's sort of standard. But in the Arctic, that hasn't been standard, partly because it's so expensive outfitting an expedition in the Arctic. You can't drive anywhere there. And once you've gotten to an area for your archaeological excavation, you're stuck there for the whole summer. And whatever you've forgotten, you're going to have to do without. And also that if the season is so short that you have to concentrate a lot of activity in a very short time. So the strategy for much of the Arctic research, archaeological research, has been kind of a two-tier approach. One of them is that when you find something that's really nice, very interesting, and you can spot it, then you pinpoint that. You know exactly where that's located. All the rest of stuff, the junk, bones, flakes, and all this, you just put it in a big square grid, and you put it all, piled everything into one bag, and that's for a grid on this. Well, to me, there's so much that information is lost that way that you really need to pinpoint everything. Now, the problem is this is just one site. Each of those dots is an object of one sort or another on this. And very quickly, you get to the point where it's overkill. It's awfully hard to spend so much time just pinpointing each object there. But the thing is that for me, after arguing so much for the precise provenience of everything, then part of it is, well, what do I do with it? And so what I've done, I tried a number of things. Each of these is exactly where objects were found. I've been able to, with these programs, to sort out whether I want to show me all the distribution of, say, of hunting equipment, or all the distribution of cooking equipment and all, and come up with different maps. Now, one can do it, and there are sophisticated spatial statistical programs for that. But to me, that really doesn't do much. I mean, for one thing, it's not all that clear cut. So what I've done is, at least what this does is made for presentation. Now, the idea that since the book, the aim is to try to present what life is like or has been like at different times on this, their manufacturers and all. At least this is one where one can basically, by looking at the distribution here, get a sense of where people were living, working in the houses and all, and this. Now, whether this is enough to make worthwhile all that extra time that it takes for precise provenience of every object, the verdict is still out, and I'm not sure. I presented it there, and I'm just waiting for feedback from there. If anybody, say when they read that, the last section of the book, to look at it and say, oh, this is really interesting. Or if they just look at it, just turn the pages and say, well, that part is not, it's just a bunch of points, and it's not really interesting. So I'm still waiting for that on that. Okay, well, that's the main thing. In summary on this, for the archaeology that in the book is a summary of the archaeology that we have looked at over the last 70 or actually 80 years of that. And so much of that is really wrapped up with the types of objects that are found in, at least in the laboratory for circumpolar studies at the museum. We have the material there, and it is a great deal of interest, and it's there. And we are, part of our obligation for the federal government is to curate it. For the Alaska Natives themselves, the Alaska Natives, the Iñupiat, have increasingly been interested in this work. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, my wife and I were given an award by the Iñupiat themselves, and with a statement saying that how much they appreciated our work, and that in helping them develop an understanding of their own history, which is probably for us is probably the nicest award that we've ever had. I mean, to me, for an anthropologist, actually being appreciated by the people you're bothering on your research and all is really something. Now, so this has been over the last 70 years. Now the thing is, I wish that I could be around 70 years from now, because to see how much of the development of the analysis of archaeology from the last 70 years that I've been around with the archaeology up here, and how much has developed, how much more that we have learned on this. And a lot of this is because of new technologies that come in. In the next 70 years, the number of technologies that are going to be developed, to me, it's going to be tremendous. I mean, archaeology is really a dynamic science. There's no question about that. My prediction for the future, I think that for the big areas of new research, going to be, one of them to me is going to be in soil chemistry. There's so much that you can learn from soils now that when we excavated it, even 15 years ago, you'd excavate to get the objects out of, but the soil you'd basically throw away. Well, all of the soil itself has tremendous amount of information that we're just getting to. Another part is the whole DNA analysis. For the first time now, we are actually able to, through the DNA analysis, actually say what populations were where and when, and where they moved. Now that's something in the past, in fact, early at the beginning of the archaeology, that the assumption was if you have a certain style of pot or whatever, and you see it in one place and you find it in another place, that the assumption was, well, these people moved from one place to the other. And a lot of early European archaeology is based on that interpretation. Migrations of people from one group to another area and all. Obviously, it's easy enough for people to learn the technology, a technique or something. So just to find the same style pot someplace else doesn't mean that people necessarily move from one place to the other. But now with DNA, you can actually spot that. And there are some real surprises. Say in Europe now, that is very clear that we've seen where populations have come in and overwhelmed other populations in a very short time, something I wouldn't have expected. So that's another part. The other is geographic GPS, geographic positioning systems, where we've excavated. To get information, you have to excavate, you dig and all. With GPS, you can just shine electronic impulses down in the ground and pretty well interpret what is there. So you don't even need to dig anymore from these areas. On this, one lesson of that was one of our latest sites. We had a Brown University student who became an expert in GPS, did the work, and discovered that the areas that we had excavated and all of this, we came up with maps of it all. He found out there was a whole other village way below that. And the only way he found that was just simply because of the electronic impulses down to mapped out where all of that was. We had no idea there was anything else there. And so that's another area that's going to develop certainly in the next few decades. And then finally, I think the use of drones is just coming into archaeology now. And the technology from the drones, of course, archaeologists didn't develop it, but it's been developed from other agencies and all. But it's not just presentation, and it's nice to be able to see if you have a layout or a photograph of a whole site and the layout there. But it also helps with looking at relationships between one site and another, finding trails and all in an area that the drones can show on this. When you're on the ground, you just don't see it. So there are all sorts of things that are going on in the future. I just wish, if there are students or anybody who's, say, 50 years or under are going to, 50 years from now, are going to really be astonished at how much more that they can learn about an area. Okay. So thank you on this. Yeah, so entertaining any questions, Otherwise, if you don't want to say here, I'll be here, so you can just ask me questions individually then. Okay, no, thanks.
So I just want to invite, everyone, we still have more goodies from the reception, and Doug will join us in that corner over there. We have his publication that's complimentary, and please feel free to get your book signed by Doug.